Hello, I'm Elizabeth Puranam. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, the US and its allies have doubled down on the threat of sanctions in the Ukraine standoff. It's a tool they've resorted to over the past decade or so, but do such punishments really bite? And what's at stake? Also this week, as tension between Russia and the West escalates over Ukraine, Europe's energy supply is in the crosshairs. NATO says the continent must diversify its resources away from Moscow, but who could fill the gap? A new tariff weapon against the US, the World Trade Organization, authorizes China to retaliate against millions worth of annual American exports. Washington says the ruling undermines fair market competition, but does it? A buildup of Russian troops along Ukraine's border has kept Moscow's rivals on edge, wondering what Vladimir Putin's next move is. Russia's president says he doesn't intend to invade Ukraine. Leaders in Western capitals say he might attack, and a warning of a high price if he does order troops in. The UK, the European Union and the US have previously imposed Russian sanctions, and more are expected if diplomacy fails. Stock markets have reacted to the geopolitical tension, and the standoff is raising fears of a wider economic fallout. US officials have warned of what they called the mother of all sanctions against Russia, and they are expected to include measures targeting Vladimir Putin's inner circle and its ties to the West. Washington and its allies have also been discussing broader sanctions against sectors of Russia's economy, including banking and energy. The measures are meant to hurt the Russian economy, but it's feared they'll also affect those of other nations. Well, the crisis has already pushed the price of oil and gas up, but it goes beyond energy. The cost of metals used for everything from car making and electronics to kitchenware and construction have also increased. So have the prices of wheat and corn, on the possibility of a sudden supply crunch. Russia and Ukraine combined make up a quarter of global grain exports, and Kiev has called on the West to avoid spreading panic that could put its economy at risk. Well, a lot appears to be at stake. To discuss that, I'm joined by Tatiana Orlova, who's the lead emerging markets economist with Oxford Economics. She's also the founder of Emerginomics, and she's joining us from London. Very good to have you with us. So what do you make of the possible new sanctions that we've heard about so far from the US and its allies that they have been threatening Russia with?
Well, sometimes the fear of the sanctions can do more damage than the sanctions themselves. And we can see that the threat of the imminent sanctions has already done a lot of damage to the Russian markets. However, I think what we need to see now is the exact wording of the bill that the US lawmakers are going to approve, and then we will see what further damage these sanctions could do. For example, the wording of what action Russia needs to take, whether the sanctions will be imposed if Russia attacks Ukraine, or if there are cyber attacks or even information campaigns. So this kind of wording, I think, to matter a lot.
Yeah, and the US has been debating imposing sanctions, not just if Russia invades Ukraine, Russia attacks Ukraine, but actually over the actions that you've already mentioned, the cyber attacks, the sort of, information, the information wars. The US and its allies have imposed sanctions against Russia in the past, and yet we find ourselves here again after the annexation of Crimea in 2014. How effective have previous sanctions been in deterring Russia?
Well, I wouldn't say they have been very effective. I think that the Russian leadership probably has long-term political goals, and it's building its planning strategy in order to achieve those goals. So I think it's actually kind of has been general case with many sanctions, not just against Russia, but also other countries such as Venezuela and Iran, when actually, the sanctions often do not probably bring a desired effect, and sometimes they actually inflict a lot of suffering on the populations. So the sanctions are the tool which has to be used very carefully.
And given that they do affect people as much as they do governments, could they possibly backfire here and not just affect the Russian people, but others in Europe too?
Yes, I think it's quite possible. I mean, if the West were to impose further harsh sanctions against Russia, Russia could reply, with its own counter sanctions, as it was the case during the conflict of 2014-2015, when Russia actually curbed some imports from the European Union and other countries which imposed sanctions against it. So as a result, there was some damage to certain European businesses. Greek sellers of peaches or maybe owners of apple orchards in Poland could no longer send their produce to Russia. So I guess some kind of measures along those lines could also be expected.
And is Europe itself united in whatever actions are taken against Russia, let alone the US and Europe on the same page?
No, we haven't seen much unanimity. And there is, first of all, there are a lot of divisions within Europe itself, because various countries within Europe have a different degree of ties with Russia. Economic ties of some countries are much stronger. For example, Germany has traditionally built this high dependence on Russian hydrocarbon supplies. So yes, there is. We can't say that the US and Europe are on the same page.
And what is that, as well as all the uncertainty, doing, to markets? How have they been reacting? What is the sort of, I won't say pre-war, but the anticipation, the uncertainty doing to market sentiment?
Yes, as I said, the fear itself is already affecting the market. And here, first of all, the Russian markets were in a bit of a turmoil in the last few weeks. However, I want to say here that in the last few days, actually, the situation has calmed down. And this happened after Russia reacted in a relatively mild fashion to the US reply to its demands. So I think the markets have gradually started pricing out that very high geopolitical premium that was built in during the months of January.
And that's interesting. And yes, please continue.
Sorry, I was just going to mention that Ukrainian markets were also reacting with a lot of concern to these developments. So in a way, even though at the moment there is no open conflict, I mean, the situation on the border is calm. No one is shooting or killing people, but the markets are already reacting as if there was a war. So Ukraine kind of was also affected by this panic mood, and foreign investors started withdrawing their funds from Ukrainian markets.
All right, Tatiana Orlova in London, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Well, as the talk of sanctions grows louder, Europe could find itself squeezed on the energy front. It's believed that measures to limit Russia's ability to export oil and gas would be the most powerful weapon and would hurt the Russian economy. But they would also cause pain for others, most notably Europe. Russia provides around 30% of the European Union's natural gas. And if there is a war, Europe may have to turn to other supplies. The US has been working with other countries on ways to supply fuel to Western Europe nations if that happens. Dominic Kane reports from Berlin.
This is the Amur natural gas installation in central Russia, one of many such plants whose product is piped to destinations in Asia and Europe, all of which generates an export revenue of more than $200 million a day for the provider Gazprom. The greatest single market is Germany, closely followed by other European countries. Cumulatively, 128 billion cubic meters of gas flows to the EU each year, representing around a third of its annual imports. But what would happen if the Ukraine crisis became a war and all of this was suddenly switched off?
There could be an interruption of gas supplies. However, the Russian government should weigh carefully whether they really want that. While it's possible to put Europe under pressure, Europe would eventually turn to liquid gas from other countries.
If liquid gas or LNG is a solution, there are a few obvious potential suppliers, most notably the US and the state of Qatar. While neither could fill the shortfall of so much gas immediately, one analyst told me Qatar might be able to provide a more medium and long-term solution.
The Qataris indeed did supply Europe with a lot more gas in the past, but given the fact that the Europeans were not very fond of the way that the contracts were structured, Qatar pivoted to Asia and now supplies for most of the gas to them rather than the Europeans. Should there be some, say, reconsideration on the European end when it comes to the contractual elements and their compatibility with European energy law, then this might actually change the situation, at least in the medium to long term.
From the geopolitical perspective, there are increasingly loud voices in Western Europe who don't want to be so dependent on Russia for their energy supply.
We have to build the foundations of our sovereignty, which means more independence from Russia. When I look at our imports in terms of oil and gas, we are not independent from Russia. This won't happen overnight.
EU leaders have been clear that a Russian act of aggression against Ukraine would have dire consequences for President Putin and his country. It would mean an end to his hopes of switching on the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, depriving him of tens of billions of dollars in revenue and depriving the EU of hundreds of billions of cubic meters of Russian gas. The view in Berlin is that such a price is worth paying if it can deter Moscow from invasion. Ministers here don't want to arm the Ukrainians. They believe their most potent weapon against Putin is sanctions, no matter the cost. Dominic Kane, Al Jazeera, in the German capital.
Well, to discuss all of that, I'm joined now by Mike Fulwood, the Senior Research Fellow at Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, and he's joining me now from Oxford. Mr. Fulwood, thank you for your time. How worried do you think Europe is right now about its energy supply?
Thank you, Elizabeth. It should be very worried. I think obviously quite a lot of Europe's supply, not just of gas, but coal and oil as well, come from Russia. So there's obviously a lot of uncertainty about, in the event of any sort of conflict or hostility in the Ukraine, as to what might happen to those supplies. So it really is a key issue, as has been highlighted in the press and amongst the politicians.
Has it been working on a contingency plan?
Well, there's been a lot of talk. I mean, the US administration has been talking about trying to get more, well, in gas terms, liquefied natural gas to come to Europe, but that's limited to the extent that there's only so much liquefied natural gas or LNG around the world, and that's split between a number of markets, including predominantly Asia, Europe, South America, and other markets. So there isn't much spare LNG around the world at the moment.
Well, the US has been trying to find a contingency plan, as you mentioned. Washington has tried to persuade Europe in the past, though, to buy its gas, but it's found few takers. Why is that?
Well, I mean, I know President Trump talked about a deal with Freedom Gas for Europe, but that was a little more than talk, to be honest. I mean, the US LNG producer off-takers, the way the contracts are structured with the off-takers, they're pretty much free to send their gas, LNG, almost anywhere in the world, and they've tended to follow the market. So when it was cold in Asia and Asian prices were high, a lot of it went towards Japan, Korea, Taiwan, China, and to some extent India. When in the last few months of last year and part of this year, a lot of it, record amounts have come to Europe because the European prices and economics were much more favourable. So I think both buyers and sellers like the flexibility that the ability to move LNG around gives them.
All right. And what about the Nord Stream pipeline 2, which there's been a lot of attention on? It would bring piped gas from eastern Russia to western Germany, from under the Baltic Sea, but is that likely to still go ahead in this current environment?
Well, it's highly uncertain. I think clearly, if as our Prime Minister, if there's boots on the ground, there's an actual invasion of Ukraine, and then that puts the project under complete jeopardy. It's probably unlikely politically to start up while there's an actual conflict on. In the absence of that and sort of a continuation of the saber rattling, then there's a process going through to approve Nord Stream 2. And the German regulator has restarted that process. That may not finish until sort of the second half of this year. Then it has to go to the European Commission for approval. But that's really a rubber stamp. So it could get delayed because the process takes longer. But ultimately, legally, it will get approved. It then becomes a political decision as to whether or not you stop it. And that could cause huge litigation and suing for damages in the courts by the sponsors of the project. It's not just the Russians.
And the possible energy crunch that we're talking about, who do you see it hurting more? The European nations, which are so reliant on Russia for their gas, or Russia itself, which sells so much of its liquefied natural gas to Europe and earns revenues from it?
Well, it doesn't help both. I mean, I think, Russia gets a lot of revenues from exports of oil and gas and coal. But it has actually, with the high prices of the last year, it's actually built up quite a sort of a chest of dollars with which to withstand, let's say, a short cut-off of supplies. So it's got the money certainly to cover that. But I think if Russia, Gazprom, did curtail supplies, then they spent 30 to 40 years building up a reputation of being a reliable supplier, and that's all thrown out the window if they curtail supplies. I mean, they've been saying Europe should sign more long-term contracts. Okay. That's off the table, and it would be disastrous for Europe.
Mike Fulwood in Oxford, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
For more than a quarter of a century, the World Trade Organization has been meant to serve as an arbiter of commerce, but it has rarely succeeded to notch up any wins. On the contrary, it has often got caught in the crossfire when it's tried to find solutions. The US has repeatedly accused the WTO of siding with Beijing in the dispute between the two countries and has demanded its reform. The trade body is yet again angering the US. It's authorized China to retaliate against $645 million worth of US imports per year as part of a decade-old trade dispute over US anti-subsidy duties on Chinese goods. The amount was much less than the $2.4 billion that China had initially requested. Washington said it's imposed the tariffs on products, including solar panels, because they were being dumped on the market to help Chinese companies do business. It's the second time the WTO has allowed China to retaliate for US anti-dumping taxes. In 2019, the arbitrator allowed Beijing to add duties on up to $3.6 billion worth of US imports. That same year, former President Donald Trump blocked the appointment of new judges to the organization's appellate body. Well, the new ruling comes almost a year after a fragile but arguably durable trade truce between the US and China. Washington and Beijing signed a trade pact in 2020 that demands China increase its buying of US goods. The Chinese government has so far failed to meet those purchase commitments. President Joe Biden has kept duties on Chinese apparel, furniture and other items. The US imposed tariffs on at least $360 billion a year in Chinese-made goods. The WTO has said additional tariffs imposed in 2018 by the US on Chinese goods violated international trading rules. Separately, the EU has filed a case against China at the WTO for targeting Lithuania. It says Beijing was blocking Lithuanian imports. The row was sparked after Lithuania's decision to allow Taiwan, which is seen by the Chinese government as part of its territory, to open a diplomatic outpost in Vilnius. China downgraded its diplomatic relations with Lithuania, but denies ordering a boycott of the nation's goods. I'm joined now by Henry Gao, who is the Associate Professor at the Singapore Management University. He's also a member of the advisory board of the WTO Chairs Program, and he's joining us from Singapore. Mr. Gao, very good to have you with us. So how much of a surprise was this decision by the WTO? How much of a win was it for China?
Well, I guess the decision was not really surprising because this is part of a long-running dispute dating back to 10 years ago. And the WTO appellate body already ruled against the U.S. in substance 3 years ago. So the decision basically established the quantum of damage for China, but the illegality of the U.S. actions were already decided 3 years ago. So I think this is just a minor victory for China. I wouldn't say this is a big win for China.
The US is certainly angered by it, whether they see it as a win or not. And they're saying that this is, the decision reflects erroneous appellate body interpretations. What do you make of that?
Well, the U.S. has been complaining about the WTO dispute settlement system for a long time, especially on trade remedies cases, where they regarded the appellate body's decision on public body, for example, to be a serious mistake that undermines other countries' ability to tackle China's state capitalism and have a long call for reform. But personally, I wouldn't agree with U.S. review. I think the appellate body actually has made the right decision. Ironically, if you look closely at the appellate body decision 3 years ago, I mentioned earlier, actually the appellate body in that case did try to readjust its earlier jurisprudence on public body to make it easier for the U.S. to have a safeguard, subsidy measures against China. So I think the U.S. complaint is definitely misdirected.
And, the U.S. has been so angry at the WTO in the past that it's actually blocked appointments to the appellate body, which is the dispute settlement court. How much has that hampered the World Trade Organization in its ability to solve disputes between countries, would you say?
Yes, definitely. I mean, the U.S. decision to block the appellate body is another mistake made by the U.S. because, ironically, on the one hand, you are seeing that the U.S. has been complaining that China has been violating all kinds of WTO rules. On the other hand, they are undermining the WTO's ability to really enforce these rules against China by removing the appellate body, making the appellate body basically non-existent. So I think the U.S. is kind of self-contradicting. If they really want to have enforcement actions against China in the WTO, they should definitely bring back the appellate body.
Do you think that that's likely to happen under President Joe Biden? It hasn't happened so far. It was the former President Donald Trump who decided to block appointments in the appellate body. Could we see some progress now?
Well, everyone have been waiting since President Biden came into office a year ago, but I think those of us in the trade circle have by and large been disappointed by the actions of the new Biden administration because despite they are saying that the U.S. is back and the U.S. support multilateralism, they still continue the blockage just without the tweets of President Trump. So I think on appellate body, they would probably continue the blockage at least for a while until they get what they want in the WTO. But the problem is the U.S. has not even made it clear right now what they wanted in the WTO. So that makes solving the problem even more difficult.
You're not surprised by the WTO decision, the latest decision on China, but would you say that it impacts this, fragile trade truce between the U.S. and China that we've had since 2020?
That is a good point, actually, because I personally, even though I was not surprised by the decision, but I think this decision provides China some strategic leverage in the sense that it could use this authorization from the WTO to retaliate against the U.S. as a kind of a bargaining chip with the U.S., especially as the U.S. now is reviewing China's implementation of the Phase 1 agreement, where most commentators would agree that China has failed to implement the Phase 1 agreement to its fullest extent. So I think China could use these to its advantage, and maybe this would help with the truce.
All right, Mr. Gao, we have just less than a minute left, and I'd like to ask you about Lithuania as well. What do you make of the European Union taking this case to the WTO over China's actions against Lithuania?
Well, this is not surprising because the EU has been contemplating the case for a while. And I would argue that it is good that the US is taking the case to the WTO because it's much better than simply, trying to go back and forth using diplomatic channels because they are definitely not working. I think China in the case would probably cite the national security exception, just like Russia did in the case against Ukraine. So the case would be interesting to watch. I hope that the WTO panel would delineate basically what are the conditions you will need to cite the national security exception in the case.
Henry Gao in Singapore, thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.
And that's our show for this week. Get in touch with us by tweeting me at Liz Puranam and do use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or drop us an email counting the cost at aljazeera.net is our address. But there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. And that's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Elizabeth Puranam from the whole team. Thank you for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.